All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning. We are a little bit later than 11 o'clock. Well, 11 o'clock my time, at least, because I'm based in Europe. But we're finally here. Good morning. Welcome to this webinar co-hosted with SDG and SMMT. We're going to talk about the state of affairs for EU and UK CBAM. I'll be doing most of the presentation, but I actually want to give first the microphone to Mark to introduce himself and SDG a little bit. Then we'll head over to Matthew from the SMMT side, and then I think we will get into the presentation straight away. Mark, the floor is yours.
Hi guys, I just want to introduce myself. Really, I'm Mark from SDG. Some of you may have met us before. So what SDG do is we look after a lot of the supply chain. It could be to deal with logistics, it could be to do with manufacturing, but a lot of businesses within inside of the motor industry. The main area that really is looking at the sustainability as a whole. So we'll do things like help them with roadmaps and with their SAQ questionnaires or their EcoVadis, etc., and really help with it. What we found was that CBAM was coming up more and more in a lot of questions. So as an organisation, we teamed up with Brink and really said, right, okay, how can we get the message out there? A lot of people are worrying about it at the moment. They're worrying about what's going to happen in the future. So really, we thought, let's collaborate and try and get something out there for people in this industry and others, really to give them a more of a wider view of it and try and have a look at some solutions from there. So I want to thank you as well, Jan, for hosting today, and obviously thank you SMMT for getting involved as well. Again, we're always here if anyone wants to reach out and has any more questions, and I'm sure Jan will cover everything that's needed. But yeah, thank you, and then I'm back over to you, Jan.
Thank you, Mark. Matthew, if you'd like to share a few slides, perhaps, to go over.
SMMT, I'm Matthew Croucher from the SMMT, the Chief Economist. So SMMT is the trade association for the auto sector in the UK. Thanks very much again for having me and enabling us to speak and inviting many of our members to attend the webinar. So CBAM is something that we've been particularly interested in. We've got actually colleagues out in Europe at this point in time, largely around Made in Europe, which is another issue. But also looking at CBAM and how we interact with Europe moving forward. So we've had the emissions trading scheme. That is there to try and encourage large industrial energy users to improve their environmental performance on energy, and UK CBAM is to sort of designed to try and ensure that ETS isn't sort of like making domestic industry uncompetitive. So placing in the UK's instance a tax on the importation of certain goods, and in our sector, that's typically steel and aluminium is the focus. It's not vehicles specifically, but anybody bringing in more than £50,000 worth of steel or aluminium from January 2027 will have to start complying with CBAM. The EU one, which JJ is going to talk about, that's already in place, and so if you're exporting steel and aluminium products to the EU, you're already having to deal with that, and if you're a multinational company, you might already be involved in that. But it's definitely an area that's coming. We're looking to do a lot more around it on our own readiness program, etc. We've set up a CBAM interest group and to look at it. The other big issue that we've got at the moment is trying to promote this idea that the UK and the EU will link their emissions trading schemes, and if that does come about, then that gives the ability to allow for mutual recognition on the CBAM, and so exemption from the UK and the EU interaction on CBAM. So still, if you're importing goods from outside of the EU, that would be captured by the CBAM. But hopefully, moving forward, that could be something to take place. We'll wait to see how quickly that can be delivered, but that's really good. And then we've also, do quite a lot on business energy anyway. So we cover climate change agreements. We have our CBAM interest group. We have a METS group, which looks after the engagement with members in those climate change agreements or the emissions trading scheme. We have also got ESOS, SECI. There's quite a lot of acronyms flying around in the energy space, and a lot of regimes in there. We partner with, other consultants as well. So Goodrich for climate change agreements, Advantage Energy to help with group purchasing and consultancy services. And then we've also got a sustainability hub on our website, which can, again, sort of help members with, anything they need to do on the energy space, and always happy to engage with people. And then finally, I just wanted to mention the British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme, which is something that we've been pushing for, which is there's been a consultation on it, and we're expecting to hear very imminently whether or not the UK automotive will be a beneficiary of that, and we're very hopeful that that would provide potentially up to 25% discount from April 2027, but we've really been pushing to see whether or not that can be brought forward and help people even sooner. So hopefully there'll be some news coming out on that, either today or later this week. Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right. Then I suppose we will continue the presentation. We'll actually discuss EU and UK CBAM a little bit more in depth. So perhaps a quick introduction about me. My name is Jan-Joost den Brinker. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at DuBrink. We are a CBAM company, so to speak. I'll tell you a little bit more about what we do in a minute. I also serve as the Vice President of the International Association for CBAM. So I speak about the topic quite a lot. And perhaps this is the time where I can tell you a little bit about us. So we are DuBrink, like I said, we are a software company originally, but now we're moving also more into the advisory space because CBAM is a lot more than just automation. And we've come to the point where it actually makes sense to sit with customers to, figure out their supply chain, go down the supply chain, and maybe a little bit later in the presentation, you will understand why that is so important and how CBAM is actually much more a financial measure than just a compliance exercise. Because if you go and do the work correctly, you go into the supply chain, collect the data there, you'll see that it just brings you massive cost savings beyond just doing what is required. Half of my team is actually currently in Düsseldorf. We try to speak to a lot of different people dealing with CBAM. Today or this week in Düsseldorf, there's the Tube and Wire conference happening. And we've been doing quite a lot of these things over the past few years, just speaking with anyone impacted by CBAM. So perhaps you have heard of us before. We also do quite a bit of training. This was last week, actually, with some of the people from SGS, just teaching them about CBAM. This is not the verification bit of SGS. This is actually the customs side of SGS, which is also a large part of our client portfolio, customs companies, customs representatives that essentially want to learn more about CBAM or streamline CBAM in that way. So perhaps the agenda for the moment, for today, it's first of all some housekeeping just to explain how you can ask questions would be quite useful. Then I'll cover what CBAM actually is and how it came to be. Some differences perhaps between the EU and the upcoming UK CBAM. Then the downstream expansion of CBAM. So that's also going to make it a lot more relevant for the automotive sector, I believe. Then we'll talk a little bit about cost, how much CBAM is specifically going to cost you, then how to calculate those costs, and then how the process actually works, some shortcuts perhaps, and I would very much like to end with the Q&A. Now, as for the Q&A, there is a way to ask questions. You can do that by selecting the 9 dots in the bottom of your screen and selecting questions and answers or Q&A, and you can use that to ask questions. If you see questions that someone else have already asked, please just upvote them. That makes it a little bit easier to maintain. We do not have an insane amount of participants today, so it is probably going to be quite okay to ask questions, but sometimes we do these sessions with hundreds of people and it becomes a little overwhelming. You can also turn on subtitles. Just press the CC, the closed captions button there, and you can even choose to translate the subtitles to a language of your choosing. But that's, I guess, for most of you, English should be all right. Quick notice, or a quick note perhaps, we do our best to be on top of things, but CBAM is a very dynamic field. A lot of things change not on a daily basis anymore, but we do see kind of regularly that certain interpretations and certain nuances can differ from week or month to month at least. So if you do watch back this recording at a later point in time, please be aware of the fact that some of the legislation may have changed. Not always, some things are set in stone and will require like a parliamentary vote, but some details specifically related to things like fertilizers or carbon credits, which are currently under review, are still debatable or still up for discussion in that sense. So please keep that in mind as well. Then perhaps a quick throwback, and it's been a pretty wild ride, because all of 2025 we had a lot of radio silence in the field of CBAM until essentially basically the 20th. We received a couple of leaked documents, and then eventually on, I believe it was the 20th of December, they dropped, or 17th of December, sorry, the timestamp is here. They dropped document after document on you, and it was quite a lot. And there's still more documents being published as we speak. These documents are, again, formalized versions of drafts that we had received over the course of all of 2025, essentially. And they kind of show you the dynamic nature of the mechanism that CBAM really is. It changed a lot. We used to have €150 per consignment. Now it's moved to 50 tons per importer per year. But then for the UK CBAM, the threshold is set at a monetary value of £50,000 per annum, which is also a different mechanism. So it's the same mechanism, but different implementations across jurisdictions. And I think this just adds to the complexity that you will see in the market, and especially if you operate internationally across countries or across EU, UK specifically. Now, one more leaked document. Perhaps good to explain how CBAM actually came to be, and that's because in 2005 we introduced the European Emission Trading System. This is actually incorrect because the S in ETS stands for system, so ETS system is double, but I guess you can forgive me for that typo. And you have to understand that we essentially charge a fee for carbon in Europe, and we've been doing that in the UK as well. Currently, we have two systems. We have the UK ETS and the EU ETS. That has to do with the fact that, of course, Brexit, it's been split into two systems, but most other countries around the globe do not have that. And that creates a bit of a imbalance between the European emission trading system, or the carbon pricing that we have in Europe, and on the other hand, factories outside of Europe that can do whatever they want and don't necessarily have to pay for carbon. So to address this issue, we introduced what is now called a carbon border, and it follows almost the customs union of the territory, meaning that it follows the EU customs border. And at the moment of custom clearance, we will actually go and ask factories about their carbon footprint or their CO2 footprint, because it's not exactly the same as the typical carbon footprint that you may hear in PCF or other mechanisms that you may have known. We will ask them about this CO2 footprint, and we will essentially impose the same amount of money to that carbon at the moment of custom clearance. That's pretty much CBAM. The problem with the CBAM mechanism, however, is that data and goods and international trade does not go point to point. It's not a singular factory exporting goods directly into Europe. It is an interconnected mess, a network, right, where everything is flowing from Brazil to Australia to South Africa, and then it's being produced into final products in Turkey, and then sent finally to Europe, and then maybe the European company sends it to the UK. So everything is interconnected, which makes CBAM a very complicated supply chain challenge, but at the same time quite an interesting one to solve, because we basically deal with every part of the business, whether it's procurement. We have to buy material. We do not know how much it's going to cost 12 months from now or 6 months from now when the goods have been produced and shipped to our jurisdiction. But it also touches sales, because the sales team needs to know what to actually charge. It touches customs, because previously there were a lot of times where people would just custom clear goods twice. They would import things into Europe, send it maybe to Serbia for some finishing, for some processing, and then send it back into Europe. And that was completely fine because the duties were, a small percentage of the goods. But now CBAM introduces this, essentially two times paying for CBAM makes things very expensive. And that kind of exposes all these inefficiencies, I would say, that we've had probably in international trade for a very, very long time. But now, because it is such a strong financial measure, it suddenly starts to matter. And people start to realize and wake up and see, oh, wow, we've been paying duties for years and years twice. Or why are we doing that? We are importing it into Europe, we're paying CBAM, but then we are immediately sending it to Switzerland, or we're immediately sending it to the UK. Maybe you should have imported that into free circulation to begin with. And these are kind of the problems that we see and solve on a daily basis, more or less. And this is just to show that, the interconnectivity does not stop outside of Europe, because it's also perfectly normal for European factories to produce raw material that is then used in non-EU countries as precursor material and then again sent back. So it really is an interconnected ecosystem, so to speak. The problem, however, is in order to collect CBAM data, you have to fill out this Excel communication template. This is sent up and down the supply chain. So this very complicated flow of information that you see will actually also be mimicked with this communication template, which is filled out by every single supplier in the supply chain producing CBAM goods and sent up and down the supply chain, which makes for an absolute chaos, of course. And you, as a supplier, will also have to fill out these communication templates and then send them to the importer in Europe, who eventually sends that to the European Commission. And once UK CBAM kicks in, the inverse is going to be true. So there's going to be producers in Europe who are going to have to fill out this similar style communication template. We're not entirely sure yet about the data format that will be acceptable under UK CBAM, but we assume it's going to follow very, very similar types of implementations. So this is really how we kind of got started, because we realized that this is an absolute nightmare and it's a big problem that companies face, and that's how DoBrink pretty much came to be. So we offer a centralized place where if you're importing into multiple jurisdictions, you can just kind of keep that all nicely organized. If you have suppliers all over the globe, you can connect with them. If they supply to your competitors, they don't have to do the same exercise twice, because everyone kind of collaborates on an integrated network. That's pretty much what we do. Perhaps to explain what CBAM actually encompasses, it closely mimics, like I said in the beginning, it closely mimics the EU ETS. And the EU ETS, the European Emission Trading System, covers a couple of sectors. The least interesting one for me personally is the electricity one, followed maybe by hydrogen, because those are just, like, in terms of volume, not that prevalent. The biggest one is, of course, iron and steel, and aluminium is probably the second one in that category, followed by fertilizers. Fertilizers is currently undergoing a lot of scrutiny because, the food supply in Europe, especially what's happening now in the Strait of Hormuz, is also a bit of adding additional pressure to the system. But I did see a review just the other day, I believe it was even like yesterday evening, that they're now thinking of not exempting fertilizers anymore. So that would mean that essentially the sectors you see on screen right now would remain in scope for the time being, which from a CBAM point of view makes sense, because every time they introduce discussions about whether or not things should be exempt, certain sectors should be included, it does add fragility to the system. I'm generally against inflationary measures, but just knowing the rules and then just having to follow them is in a sense better than, this like, is it going to stay? Is it going to be exempt? Is also not good for the mechanism. So in that sense, I think it's definitely kind of a positive change for once within the CBAM space. Perhaps to talk about who's actually impacted by CBAM. And it does mention EU declarants here, but from a UK CBAM point of view, of course, these would be UK declarants as well. We have suppliers in scope, sub-suppliers, of course, because CBAM does not just stop at your tier 1 supplier. It actually requires you to go down the supply chain, and the official legislation says until no more CBAM goods are there. That means that if you produce CBAM goods yourself, but you make these CBAM goods from CBAM goods, then it's quite essential to go and figure that out all the way to the very first CBAM good in the supply chain. Traders and intermediaries are, of course, also impacted, whether that is a customs representative acting on behalf of importers or a trading company based out of Switzerland that is just buying commodities from South Korea and selling them to European importers. This is daily business for us. We see all these kind of complexities all the time. And then additional parties involved could be consultants, people helping importers, helping suppliers, auditors, verification companies, things like that. Because, of course, it's nice of you to calculate CBAM, but without a strong verification network, like a strong verification mechanism, I apologize, it doesn't hold up, right? So you do need to have some sort of police, and I use that term loosely, but you need someone to double check to give credibility to the system. So the verification component in CBAM is quite important. And like I said before, when we talk about CBAM, we're not just talking about EU CBAM, we're also talking about UK CBAM. Perhaps some differences that would be interesting for the audience to learn is that electricity is not in scope for UK CBAM, for example. So when you are importing as a Danish company electricity from the UK, that falls under CBAM, but the other way around would not happen. That's of course much more focused around offshore electricity, like wind and water, but perhaps good to highlight. Also, the European Union and European CBAM is quite decentralized in a sense, because it is really managed on a national level, whereas in the UK, of course, it's a lot easier because it's really just like a much smaller jurisdiction to manage, but it is much more centralized in this sense. CBAM EU followed a very phased approach. It started with a transitional phase that took about 3 years, 2 years and 1 quarter, I believe. And now, since January 1st, we've entered the definitive phase. UK CBAM is not going to be like that at all. The moment January 1st comes around, January 1st, 2027, we will immediately start with the real phase of CBAM, so to speak. Then default values are permitted in the European Union without a limit, but for UK CBAM, that's going to be a little bit different because there is expected to be some sort of like cutoff period for that. But the default values are also going to be set slightly different. They're thinking about setting default values based on commodity codes, whereas in the European Union, they're set for commodity codes and countries of origin, meaning that the same commodity from different jurisdictions could theoretically be much more expensive. And in practice, that's also what we see. I may have a slide or two about that to show you. Then the last thing that you may need to know really as a difference is that CBAM EU works with certificates, meaning that you declare the amount of CO2 imported and you will buy certificates, and those certificates are then surrendered to cover the imported emissions. Whereas in UK CBAM, it's much more like a tax liability that is incurred at the moment of import. Those are high level kind of the main differences, I say. There are definitely some nuances here. But if this is something that impacts you specifically, we would have to be a little bit more patient because not everything has been formalized yet. A technical review or technical consultation has been opened just last week for the second draft of the CBAM implementation. So for the final details, we will have to wait until everything is officially set in stone, I suppose. Then perhaps a quick timeline. So as I said, October 2023, that's really when the transitional period for CBAM started. Fast forward to January 2026. Now CBAM EU is in full effect. Any import crossing the border in the affected sectors will immediately be subject to CBAM. We saw containers getting stuck already many times because people didn't do their authorization. We see shockingly high CBAM costs that have not been forecasted properly. People think, some finished goods, 60, 70 euro surcharge is completely fine. Think about fasteners, think about bolts, things like that. That's as far from the truth as you can be. And I'll show you a slide where we actually break down the cost of the different finished goods, specifically fasteners, and you will actually see how much the surcharge for CBAM is going to be, and that it is really something that you should include in both your procurement and sales processes, because it is otherwise going to cost you your business. On the 7th of April, 2026, the European Commission published the first price for the CBAM certificates, which is, as you can see, also kind of a complexity, because the price for the quarter is set after the quarter has been completed. So you will never really have absolute certainty how much goods are going to cost. For now, we have quarterly prices, but then from next year, we're going to have weekly prices, which again makes things difficult to forecast, because the EU price fluctuates quite a bit, especially when it becomes a topic of political discourse. Then, of course, like I said, in January 2027, we will start with the UK CBAM. There will be no transitional period, and we will pretty much start paying straight away. And for those that want to catch up on these slides, we will share the slides with SMMT afterwards, along with the recording, and both of those will be shared with you at a later point. Then the downstream expansion, and this is specifically for the SMMT members quite interesting, because right now CBAM targets primarily commodities, with the small exception for finished goods like fasteners, because that's the only sector really currently that is like almost a finished product that you can import from China and sell. All the others probably require some sort of processing before you can use them. And that's also why, of course, the lobby groups for fasteners were so against CBAM, because it's the only product that's not included, but they have kept it in despite numerous attempts to kick them out. Downstream expansion is going to bring all of the other sectors, or all of the other finished products made from steel and aluminium, in scope. And this is actually an example of the goods that are currently under review. So for now, CBAM in iron and steel targets Chapter 72, 73, and 74 of the Customs Code of the Union. That excludes most products made from steel, like finished products. The picture in the bottom left corner, that is an aluminium stairwell, or an aluminium ladder, sorry. That ladder is made entirely from aluminium, minus maybe a few rubber feet at the bottom. That should be under CBAM, but it is not, because it falls under a different customs, a different CN code. That's going to change a lot, because once the downstream expansion is introduced, that's when you're going to see all these products made from steel, made from aluminium, that are classified as furniture, classified as a crane. Those will then also become a part of CBAM. Then what is important to understand is that there are two types of values, and this is a mechanism that exists both in EU and UK CBAM. There are two types of values that you can basically respond with to a data request or to an import. If you import goods, data is requested, and you either provide default data or actual data. And this is what I want to talk about next. What you need to understand is that the default values are set in the case of EU CBAM by the European Commission. It's based on countries of origin, and the actual values are basically data points provided by the supplier, which have been independently verified by accredited verifiers. The default values are quite punitive. They are quite high. If you don't do any CBAM calculations in your factory, if you do not pass verification, you will by default use default values. If I show you the next slide, this is quite a shocking slide. And I can tell you, we've been doing CBAM for the past 3 years. And when we actually put together this graphic, the team was quite surprised, because the same CN code, you can see the CN code at the top left corner, 73181520, it's a hexagon bolt. If you import the exact same product from Indonesia, you're going to have to think about 580 euro per ton of surcharge. If I import that product from the UK, I only pay 128 euro per ton. Now, of course, this is only the CBAM cost, and I am aware that products from Indonesia and China are probably substantially cheaper than they would be from Australia or the UK, not to mention transport. However, once you start to see that these enormous differences exist, you also start to realize that it's literally changing international trade, because people will just say, okay, well, there's this whole problem with Chinese suppliers or Indian suppliers. If I go and get their data, it's going to be really hard. Is it going to be verified in time? You know what? I will rather pay the premium in terms of like material cost, but then at least I can use default values in the UK, and it's going to be so much cheaper. I have the certainty up front. So we really see changes like that. But it is also not shifting all of the international trade to a particular country, because if we look at the aluminium profiles on the right, it's a different sector, right? It falls under aluminium in this case. The chapter of the customs code is chapter 76. You'll see that actually the worst country in this case is China, which would cost around 300 euro per ton, whereas a Brazilian supplier of the exact same product, right, would cost only 60 euro per ton. And in this case, this is also why you can see that CBAM is a lot less of a political measure in this regard, and it is much more about how things are produced. And you have to understand that when steel is produced in Indonesia, they use nickel pig iron for that. That's probably one of the worst materials you can have, environmentally speaking. Whereas if you look at how aluminium is produced in Brazil, it's traditionally done with very efficient solar-based installations. And this is where those differences come from. And of course, if I am a producer in Indonesia that actually does everything without perhaps nickel pig iron in a very environmentally clean way, I only have to prove that I am doing it in that way. And I would not have to, burden my importers, my customers, with that surcharge of 600 euro per ton, but I would actually just, they only have to pay essentially the amount that I actually emit, which in a sense makes it a much fairer mechanism than perhaps something like an anti-dumping or a tariff that you would just slap on a particular CN code or a particular country of origin. And that's really where the nuance lies between, let's say, CBAM and other measures that we've seen in international trade. This is another example. I will not cover it in too much detail, but I think what is interesting to see is that we do see, of course, Indonesia and China typically leading this chart, and that's not a good thing, because it means that their products are environmentally polluting. But we do see, for example, that in this case, unwrought aluminium from the US is actually, quite cheap in comparison to Chinese aluminium. And then the question becomes, okay, what about the material? Of course, American aluminium is probably a lot more expensive than Chinese material, but the conversation in international trade is really changing, because the CO2 surcharge becomes part of the discussion. And then a question about what if country data is missing, because the default values are not always there. And in that case, you fall back to what is considered other countries and territories. On the screenshot that I'm showing right now, it's either the third or the fourth one. And that's basically a summary, or sorry, not a summary, it's an average of the 10 worst, which funnily enough can still put it lower in the list. It doesn't always move it to the worst place. Then the question, how much will CBAM cost? We saw, of course, a few examples, but I first want to explain briefly how the calculation works, because there's a lot of confusion about that. And it also causes, I guess, it really causes the confusion. I think I already said it in the first sentence. The calculation is not product times whatever footprint times price or something like this. It does not work like that. And the reason for this complexity has to do with the fact that it must be fair. And everyone has different ways of producing the same product. So in order to be able to compare it equally to the European production of the same product, we need to be able to mimic every single step of the production value chain. And that's essentially what is reflected within this calculation. So the pink thing that you see on screen, the specific embedded emissions, this is what everyone is after. This is the emission intensity of the product that you are essentially importing. Then we have this whole part in green, which is essentially the European discount, or the free allocation is what it's called, the SEFA, the specific embedded free allocation. And this essentially represents the same emission intensity of a product if it was produced in Europe. So you do not pay for the entire emission intensity, you pay only for the difference between a comparable product produced in Europe. Then there is this whole part in blue, which represents carbon prices paid abroad. For the moment, this is not relevant because the carbon price paid is not recognized yet within the European system. It will be relevant probably from 2027 onwards, and then you would be able to say, okay, I've paid £25 per ton in the UK already for this good, and you would be able to subtract that. And then the part in red is the amount of products you've imported. Now, where all these variables come from, I don't want to bother you with that too much considering the time, but you just have to understand that the CBAM factor is actually a direct replica in the sense of the European free allowance. So as European producers will pay more for CO2, you will also pay more for CBAM, just to make sure that the mechanism equally, they're really connected, and that's important to understand. Like I said, the part in blue we can skip. And then what you have to understand about this formula is that it will give you the number of certificates, because the European system is more complex than the UK system will be. And the number of certificates doesn't give you money. It just gives you the number of certificates. These certificates you then have to buy against either a quarterly price in 2026 or a weekly price in 2027, depending on the date of custom clearance. And if we do that, we actually now have the price for Q1 that was set at €75.36. But for Q2, 3, and 4, we actually don't know what an import is going to cost, because these prices, like I said in the beginning, are set at the end of the quarter. So you also need to forecast almost now as procurement, where is the EU ETS price going? Where's the carbon price going? Because the price difference between Q2 and Q3 is €7 per ton. If you import 2,500 tons in one quarter, that's a lot of extra money that you probably didn't account for in your initial assumptions. So if we do the calculation and plugging in some of the numbers that are associated with an import of 8,000 tons, you'll see that as there are different prices for each quarter, the same import, four times we are importing 2,000 tons, you'll see have quite substantial differences. And in this case, you would be paying €1.3 million for an import. Now, this is using default values. But the default values are, like we saw earlier, set punitively. If we instead go to the factory in China, verify the data, and have it, of course, done by a European accredited verifier, you'll see that the SEE will be much lower. The lower this value is, the lower the surcharge you will have to pay at the moment of custom clearance in Europe. And the exact same import with the same prices will not cost you €1.3 million, but it would cost you only €400,000 in CBAM cost. That's a difference of almost 70%. And this is why it is so critical to go and find out how the goods are produced and to get the data verified, because it will just literally cost you a third of the price. And then there is this thing about the recursive benchmark calculation. So we saw briefly this benchmark. It's one of the two green boxes on screen. What you need to understand about the benchmark, or specifically about all of the data really that you're collecting, so whether it's the pink one or the green ones, you have to understand that it is a recursive calculation, because CBAM goes back to the very first CBAM good within the value chain. So if you have to look at this diagram from right to left. If I have a hot rolled coil, that is HRC, the one on the right, that product itself is made from crude steel. That's precursor 1 in the diagram. You have to understand that precursor 1 is not verified because it's red. If precursor the second precursor in this is verified, it will impact the final value of the hot rolled coil, because you have to use a weighted average of all of the raw material that is used to produce the final good. So this is quite a complicated calculation, but you have to understand that the more actual data you collect, meaning the deeper you go into your supply chain to actually find out the like all of the different emission factors that are used, and that also must of course also be verified. But the farther down you go, the more you will be able to reduce the CO2 footprint, because if you don't get verified, that part of the value chain would use default values. And as we saw, the default values are set quite punitively. And I don't know, there's a bunch of boxes around, but just skip that. I think that's really the main point. Then maybe just to sum things up, where we see the biggest problems. I think, first of all, the complexity of emissions data is one of the biggest ones. It's quite hard. What you need to collect, like the scope of the data, is also quite wide. You need to really go into your supply chain and go and collect this information. Then previously, nobody thought about calculating the free allocation, but the way I produce my steel is different from the way you produce your steel. And that production method determines how much you can eventually subtract from the emissions that are reported. There's also different CBAMs. The UK methodology will be, to an extent, quite different than the method of EU CBAM. We are advocating quite strongly for, in this sense, a similar CBAM, right? At least that there would be mutual recognition of the verification, for example. Because as a supplier, the last thing you want to do is a full-scale verification project and then doing it again under different terms, because EU and UK CBAM don't, recognize one another, for example. And then lastly, the verification pressure, because every step of the supply chain would need to be verified independently by an accredited verifier in order for the verification to be recognized, or at least in order to be able for you to reduce your CO2 footprint, because otherwise that step of the value chain would just use default values. CBAM as a process is one of the last things I want to cover. So I want to just explain to you how the verification process works. So the European accreditation body will accredit a member state accreditation body will accredit a verification company. Think about, the usual suspects, the ones that are currently verifying under the EU ETS, whether that is, SGS, Bureau Veritas, TÜV, companies like this. They will go to a member state, they will ask for accreditation, and once they receive accreditation, they will be tasked with going to an operator, which is basically the supplier in simpler terms. They go to a supplier's location, factory, they check all the data there. This data is added to the CBAM registry and can then basically be used by the declarants. We try to add a layer on top of that. We work with verification companies. They use our tool to, for example, do verification for suppliers, making it a lot quicker to do it. But we also manage things like procurement, imports, all of the declarations. If you need to track financial guarantees, give you a full audit trail, and allow you to manage the certificates that you need to purchase. That's maybe where things get much more from reactive to proactive, because you really want to be able to control CBAM. You want to know what your CBAM costs are going to be 6 months from now, 3 months of production, 3 months on a ship, and then eventually it will arrive in Europe. Maybe it's better to put the goods in a warehouse, a bonded warehouse for 2 weeks, because by the time that the quarter is over, we actually think the CBAM costs are going to drop. These are the type of things that move, CBAM much more to things like procurement rather than just purchasing departments, because you start to look at everything you're doing in your company much more strategically. And this is also part of what we're trying to do as a company. Our platform is something that makes it quite easy to use abroad. It's available in 29 languages. We have a worldwide network of people that actually know what they're doing, what CBAM is, and how to use our tool. And yeah, if you have any questions related to CBAM after this, feel free, of course, to reach out. The way it works is you simply add your imports and send that to your suppliers. Your suppliers are probably already using our system, simply because we're dealing with 2,200 importers at the moment using our platform in Europe. And you can imagine that the supplier network behind that is quite vast. And then at the end, which is what everybody hates, we do a one-click report, because if you don't do that, you have to manually enter every single import into the European system. We're not entirely sure how the UK system is going to work, but we assume it will follow a very, very similar mechanism. And that's why, having a central system in place could be quite advantageous. 3 pillars, I guess, or 3 ways you can currently take control of CBAM in your company. The first one is really try to automate it. Like, we've really moved beyond Excel sheets today. It doesn't make sense. You can literally not model the kind of costs that you cannot collect the data efficiently when you have more than 10 suppliers, and especially if you need to collect also their suppliers' information. It makes it hard to model the cost, and I would really advise you to start modeling your costs today. And lastly, I would highly advise you all to look at desktop audits, because you can check data that you receive from your supplier. And if you've been doing CBAM for a while, you can probably figure out if that data makes sense. Yesterday, we had a customer of ours who are both producers and importers. They own the factory in China. They reported 250,000 megawatts of electricity, which for comparison is about 3.5 million times charging a Tesla Model 3. And that's just because of a comma versus a dot. It was supposed to be 250, not 250,000. These type of mistakes happen many times a week. We see that all the time. So you're going to be the one who's going to pay for that. Of course, this would never pass verification, but not passing verification would then bring you to the default values, which is probably also not desirable. So yeah, I think there is a lot of things you can do today with the data that you may already have to actually check, like, does this make sense? And if you can't answer that question, or if you simply don't have the data, then I think you know what you'll need to do next, because that's really the starting point, right? Find the data and then go and inspect it. We have a CSE available. We call those colleagues CBAM Success Engineers. I hope that is a self-explanatory name. We try to basically save you time and make sure that you are successful with CBAM. Then last but not least, try to get the basics right. If you're in Europe, you have to register as an authorized declarant. You have to do that for the UK CBAM as well, but it is not possible yet. Make sure you're not doing CBAM for things that are not subject to CBAM. Classifying your goods correctly is quite critical. I think we see that a lot as well. Try to map your supply chain. Make sure that you can actually see where the data is going. Have a conversation with your suppliers. Are you actually already verifying, in the process of getting verified? Do you have monitoring plans available? These are the things that are necessary for verification to be successful. So please keep that in mind. And of course, more on the strategic side, try to plan the best case, worst case scenario. Potentially explore hedging. Like, there are ways that you can control your CBAM exposure today that would potentially save you from these fluctuating costs in the future. Think about where you're sourcing from, and educate your team, I suppose, is the last piece of advice that I would like to give you all today.